For 30 years, the red velvet curtain of NBC's Studio One in Burbank was the most coveted threshold in the world. To walk through it and hear the words, "He ears Johnny," was to be anointed by the high priest of American culture. For the stars of Hollywood's golden age, a seat on that rainbow-colored couch next to Johnny Carson wasn't just a guest appearance. It was a career-defining validation. But behind the polite social smiles and the rhythmic banter of The Tonight Show, there existed a much darker reality. Within the top drawer of Carson's mahogany desk sat a legendary unwritten blacklist. It was a private catalog of the fallen, a record of 11 names who committed the ultimate taboos of television. These were the individuals who walked into the studio like royalty, but left as sinners who would never be forgiven. Johnny Carson was a man of the old generation who valued honor and professional grace above all else. Before he was the king of late night, he was the Great Carson, a skilled stage magician who understood the mechanics of deception and the sanctity of the spotlight. He had no patience for charlatans, no tolerance for the arrogant, and a chilling response for those who dared to betray his trust. To the audience, he was the witty, laughing host who slapped his desk at every joke. But to those who crossed him, he was a steely judge who could execute a reputation with a single sharp stare or a permanent deafening silence. Tonight, we pull back that curtain to reveal the execution ground of the entertainment industry. From the psychic who was humiliated by 22 minutes of dead air to the beloved protege who delivered a knife to the back, these stories are not found in any broadcast script. We explore the moments where the masks slipped, where the talking machines failed, and where the most powerful man in television proved that while reputation is built over a lifetime, it can collapse in a single night of shame. This is the definitive account of the 11 guests who acted shamefully on The Tonight Show, and the silent sentences Johnny Carson passed upon them. To understand the true nature of Johnny Carson, one must first understand the mind of a magician. Before he became the king of television, Carson performed under the stage name The Great Carson. This background gave him a unique perspective on the entertainment industry. There was nothing he detested more than a charlatan using cheap tricks to deceive a gullible audience. On the night of August 1st, 1973, this professional disdain met its ultimate target, the young Israeli psychic Uri Geller. At the time, Geller was a global phenomenon, seemingly capable of bending metal and fixing broken watches with nothing but the power of his mind. The public viewed him as a messenger from a powerful spiritual world, but Carson viewed him through the lens of a skeptic. The drama that unfolded was not a random failure, but a sophisticated trap set by Carson himself. Before the cameras rolled, Carson had secretly consulted with James Randi, a legendary expert in debunking frauds. Following Randi's strict advice, the Tonight Show crew prepared all the props themselves and forbade Geller or his team from touching them before the performance. When Geller took the stage radiating his usual confidence, he was met with a row of spoons and jars he hadn't been able to tamper with. The result was 22 agonizing minutes of dead air, a period that became known as some of the most brutal psychological torture in television history. Geller fumbled his smile, distorted into a mask of confusion, as the metal remained rigid and cold. He sweated bullets before millions of viewers, offering weak excuses about feeling under pressure or lacking strength. Throughout the ordeal, Carson remained frighteningly calm. He didn't mock or scold. He simply sat with his arms crossed, allowing the silence and the guests' impotence to expose the truth. While Geller's fame ironically grew among some who believed his powers were simply blocked, for Carson the night was a success. He had used his stage to strip away the mask of a man he considered a fraud. However, Carson's role as a judge wasn't limited to the world of psychics. In January 1968, he faced a different kind of true believer, Jim Garrison, the district attorney of New Orleans. Garrison arrived with thick files and shocking conspiracy theories regarding the assassination of President Kennedy. He expected Carson to be a superficial host, a mere clown, who would provide him a platform for sensationalism. Instead, Garrison walked into a public execution of his credibility. Carson had spent days and nights studying the case files to prepare for the encounter. When Garrison began spinning stories of mysterious spies and vague links, Carson transformed into a steely prosecutor. He relentlessly queried Garrison for names and physical evidence, his tone calm but his pressure crushing. The eloquent lawyer began to stumble and stutter, his conspiracies collapsing under the weight of Carson's razor-sharp logic. By the end of the night, Garrison left dazed and stripped of his professional standing. Johnny Carson had proven that behind the desk of a funny host was a brilliant mind that refused to be led by the nose. While the exposure of frauds and conspiracy theorists was a matter of professional duty for Johnny Carson, the events of 1986 were far more personal. This was the year the most beautiful friendship in American television met a cold and sudden end. The relationship between Johnny Carson and Joan Rivers had spanned nearly 2 decades and was often described as being as close as father and daughter. As the brightest heir apparent and the only person Johnny truly trusted to occupy the Tonight Show hot seat in his absence, Joan was the undisputed princess of the program. Audiences were accustomed to seeing Johnny double over with laughter at her acerbic wit, and it was widely assumed she would inherit his massive legacy when he eventually retired. However, the foundation of this bond was trust, and in the world of old-school show business trust, once broken leaves a wound that never heals. The conflict began when the fledgling Fox network approached Joan Rivers with the opportunity of a lifetime, her own late-night talk show. The catch was that the show would compete directly with Johnny, and Fox demanded absolute secrecy during negotiations. Torn between her deep loyalty to her mentor and her own professional ambition, Joan chose to remain silent, fearing that her godfather might try to stop her. That silence proved to be a death sentence for their friendship. News of the defection leaked to the press before Joan could tell Johnny herself. When she finally picked up the phone with trembling hands to confess the truth and seek a blessing, she was met with a bone-chilling coldness. Carson did not scream or rage. He simply stated briefly that he had already heard the news from someone else. The dry click of the telephone hanging up signaled the end of an 18-year relationship. It was a punishment that went far beyond business. Immediately following that call, Johnny Carson issued an unspoken but brutal embargo. He treated Joan Rivers as if she had never existed, removing her photos and shelving old tapes. He never mentioned her name on the air again. For a man like Johnny, the hurt did not stem from Joan seeking her own success, but from the fact that she had not honored him with the truth first. Joan Rivers achieved her dream of having her own show, but the price was the permanent estrangement of her mentor. They never spoke again, and Johnny passed away years later without a single word of farewell to the woman he had once treated as family. While the sting of betrayal was a quiet, cold affair, the Tonight Show stage often played host to much more explosive displays of disrespect. In the mid-1980s, Chevy Chase was at the peak of his power, a comedic phenomenon who walked as if all of Hollywood was lying at his feet. But when he stepped onto The Tonight Show, the audience and Johnny Carson witnessed a performance of megalomania rather than artistic talent. Chase lacked the humility or respect most stars showed the godfather of television. Instead, he entered with the swagger of a superior. He slumped into his chair as if he were bestowing a favor upon the show by his mere presence. From the opening minutes, the atmosphere became suffocatingly awkward. Chase constantly interrupted Johnny, throwing out offensive jokes and insulting the audience's intelligence. The peak of the discomfort was Chase's visible disdain for the program itself, behaving as if The Tonight Show were an outdated relic. Carson, the master of elevating his guests, eventually decided to let go. He allowed Chase to drown in his own tactless monologue, exposing the hollow nature of the star's glamour. When the cameras cut to commercial, the social smile on Johnny's lips vanished instantly, replaced by a cold silence. Chase left unaware that he had just etched his name into a permanent blacklist. However, the arrogance of an A-lister was nothing compared to the volatility of a drunkard. The night of September 26, 1975 remains one of the most infamous in television history due to the appearance of British actor Oliver Reed. Known for his rugged acting and excessive alcoholism, Reed arrived not as an English gentleman, but as a belligerent drunk, ready to fight the world. Sitting alongside him was veteran actress Shelley Winters, a woman who had no tolerance for injustice. Reed, with blurry eyes and slurring speech, began to utter rude sexist comments suggesting that women were only born to serve men in the kitchen. Carson attempted to play the role of a reluctant referee, using humor to steer the conversation, but Reed ignored every warning signal. The tension finally broke when Winters' patience exploded. In a decisive action that stunned the studio, she grabbed a glass of water and dumped it directly over Reed's head. As the ice-cold stream ran down his expensive suit, the audience erupted in applause. Reed sat frozen, a drowned rat, humiliated before millions of viewers. Carson, maintaining his composure, quietly observed the price paid by a guest who turned his professional stage into a common pub. Beyond the immediate scandals of betrayals and brawls, there was a quieter, more exhausting form of disrespect that Johnny Carson endured: the burden of the talking machine. In the eyes of the 1980s public, the pairing of Johnny Carson and Jerry Lewis was a symbol of entertainment power. But backstage, it was a source of dread. Carson's close lawyer Henry Bushkin revealed that Johnny felt a heavy fatigue whenever Lewis's name appeared on the guest list, privately confessing that entertaining the comedy icon felt like hard labor. When the cameras rolled, Jerry Lewis would often dominate the space with a sense of megalomania, refusing to be just a guest, and instead turning The Tonight Show into his own pulpit. Instead of the gentle, humorous banter the show was known for, Lewis would descend into solemn, grave sermons about life and philosophy. Carson would sit there hiding his extreme endurance behind a mask of calm, but his eyes exuded a boredom that only insiders truly understood. He eventually used silence as a self-defense weapon, letting Lewis's excessive ego expose the collapse of an old idol's image. This industrial fatigue was even more pronounced when it came to a living symbol of America, Bob Hope. For Johnny, Hope's appearances in his later years were a form of pre-programmed torture. Hope did not come to engage in conversation. He came with a stack of scripts and note cards written by his staff down to every comma. There was an invisible wall between them, the wall of not listening. Whenever Johnny tried to ask a sincere human question, Hope would ignore it entirely to deliver a pre-planned one-liner about politics or gas prices. To Carson, the master of improv, being turned into a background clown for Hope's self-promotion was deeply insulting. Hope viewed the program as a free billboard for his upcoming NBC specials, dumping his script and repeating his broadcast schedule without any genuine human connection. On air, Carson would laugh, slap his desk, and lean back as if he were enjoying himself, but his eyes remained empty. It was the most painful, industrial laugh of his career, and when Hope finally left the stage, Carson would often slump his shoulders and let out a long sigh of relief, as if lifting a 1,000-pound weight. While the talking machines brought boredom, other guests brought a much more palpable sense of danger to The Tonight Show. Throughout the early 1980s, Johnny Carson had made the king of Las Vegas, Wayne Newton, a recurring target in his opening monologues. With a sharp, satirical tone, Carson poked fun at Newton's groomed mustache, high-pitched voice, and flashy outfits, much to the delight of the studio audience. However, the patience of one of the most powerful men in the entertainment underworld eventually ran out. One afternoon at the NBC studio in Burbank, the atmosphere turned thick with murderous intent when Wayne Newton appeared unannounced. Brushing past security, Newton stormed into Carson's private office, a sanctuary few dared to enter. Facing Carson without the protection of stage lights or a microphone, Newton delivered a chilling ultimatum in a low, steel-hard tone. He warned that if the jokes didn't stop, he would skip the lawsuit and beat Carson to a pulp on the spot. Carson, a man who rarely showed fear, was visibly stunned by the deadly seriousness in Newton's eyes. he gave a rare slight nod of concession. From that night forward, every joke about Wayne Newton vanished from the script, marking a rare moment where the king of late night truly knew fear. This intensity was mirrored, albeit in a different form, by the disaster of emptiness brought by Ryan O'Neal. In the early 1970s, O'Neal was Hollywood's golden prince, but his appearance on the show proved that beauty does not equate to charm. O'Neal sat there like a carved statue, offering nothing but indifferent shrugs and one-word answers to Carson's leading questions. Carson was forced to use double his usual energy, effectively interviewing himself to fill the deadly silences. To Carson, this level of blandness was more than just a bad interview. It was a professional insult. Even more tragic was the decline of Truman Capote. Once a literary genius of sharp wit, Capote's later appearances were a heartbreaking display of a soul disintegrating from substance abuse. He walked with a swaying gait, his eyes glazed and his speech slurred. Instead of his trademark satire, he rambled nonsense and crude secrets, seemingly unaware of his surroundings. Carson, acting out of pity and old friendship, did his best to steer the sinking ship, signaling the band to play louder, to cover the gaps in Capote's coherence. It was a somber farewell to a legend whose golden age had forever passed. Amidst the stories of betrayal and public collapse, there was one name on the blacklist that represented something entirely different: Charles Grodin. In the history of The Tonight Show, there was an unwritten rule that every guest must be cheerful and humble, but Grodin chose to tear up that rule book. His appearances often felt like a hostage situation on live television, where he would march onto the stage with a funeral face and unleash condescending complaints. He openly bullied Johnny Carson, criticizing his questions as dumb and sighing at the audience. The amazing trick, however, was that this shameful behavior was actually a masterclass in double-act comedy. While the audience believed Grodin was the rudest man in the world, Carson loved the aggression so much that he signed Grodin to an exclusive contract. It was a relationship based on a deep, unspoken respect between two geniuses of improvisation, proving that for Carson, even rudeness could be an art form if it served the show. The 11 names and stories we have walked through are far more than mere entertainment scandals. They serve as brutal proof of an unwritten Hollywood law. Reputation is built over a lifetime but can collapse in a single moment of arrogance, a crude joke, or uncontrolled drunkenness. Johnny Carson has since departed, taking his witty smile and powerful presence to the other side. Yet the silent sentences he passed on these guests remain valid today. Through his decades behind the desk, Carson taught us an expensive lesson. Grace and respect for the audience are the eternal tickets to longevity. Ridiculousness and ego, even when draped in the glamorous coat of fame, ultimately leave only humiliation when the studio lights finally go out. Behind the glamour of the stars lie these bitter truths exposed by the man who held the most powerful seat in television history.